All right, let's go ahead and get started. And I want to thank you all for tuning in and joining us. We are continuing with our Connecting the Community discussion series. And to say that I'm excited about the panel that I have today will be an understatement. It's definitely beyond a privilege, a pleasure, and a treat to be able to spend time with colleagues of mine, friends of mine, and educators that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. And so I'm glad you all are here to join us in a part of the conversation that I will say a lot of cases we use the words uncomfortable or difficult. I think we should consider using the word necessary because part of us being better and doing better as educators is having a deeper understanding of the diversity within the educator workforce, as well as the diversity of experiences, diversity of perspectives, all across anything you can think of. So I'm thrilled that you all are here. And without further delay, I'll stop sharing my screen so that we can begin the process. So what I'd like to do first is kind of introduce the panel today. So we're covering 3 different time zones in the United States. So we've got the Eastern time zone with Felisa Ford. Say hi, Felisa.
Hi, how are you doing? So happy to be here.
Wonderful. And the incomparable Jennifer Hall.
Hello, good to see you all. I'm so excited to be here for this conversation. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you for being here. And then, of course, the amazing Dr. Sausan Jaber.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me, Ken.
See, I told you, what an amazing panel. All right, so let's just dive right in. So I cannot thank you 3 enough for being here and for sharing what will be your experiences and your thoughts around the questions that I have. And I don't know if you all had the chance to check out the previous conversations that we had, but ultimately the goal with this is for those that are watching and those that are listening to be able to learn more about you, your experiences, and how that will hopefully serve as a catalyst for them being more informed and better educators. So with that being said, I would like to address the first question, which all 3 of you will have an opportunity to answer it. I'd like to address the first question to Felisa, which is if you could share with our audience a little bit about your background and how you got to the point you are now, please.
Okay, absolutely. So I am a 27-year veteran educator. I am currently a digital learning specialist with Atlanta Public Schools, but I have also been a high school administrator, and I was the former K-12 social studies coordinator for Atlanta Public Schools. So social studies has always been in my blood, and just education has always been in my blood. I'm 27 years in the game, Ken.
You are a veteran. But you know what? I will say, hopefully with experience comes knowledge, and knowledge that you're able to share with all of us here. So thank you. And again, it's such a privilege for you to be here. And so then next, let's stay in the Atlanta area. And Jen, please.
Hey, I'm so excited. It's funny that, Felicia and I actually worked together in Atlanta. So this is an honor to share this space with her.
Absolutely.
So I not as many years in the game as you have. This is my 24th year in education. Hence the reason my hair is gray and my screws are loose. I was a former middle school language arts teacher for 17 years and then became an ed tech specialist. And what that means is I provide technology training to teachers around the district and push into classrooms and work with teachers to best integrate technology in their standards-based lessons. So I love my job because I get to work with teachers and students, but I started as a middle school classroom teacher and loved that. Teaching middle school was amazing, and being a language arts teacher. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm just super excited to participate and share space with these awesome folks.
So I spent most of my career teaching middle school. So that's another thing that you and I can talk about the next time that I see you, which I hopefully is sooner rather than later.
Yes.
And then, so now we're going to go to our central time zone. And another educator that I'm very fond of is Dr. Sausan Jaber. So Dr. Jaber, if you will share a little bit about your role and your background with our audience, please.
Sure. So I'm in year 22 in education currently. I consider myself a global educator because I've done so much work both here and abroad, and I've worked in so many different positions from K through 12. I'm currently a high school English teacher in the suburbs of Illinois. And I think that you asked what got us here. For me, I think my hyphenated identity is a big reason why I am here. As a Muslim, Palestinian, American female, and kind of all of my intersections have led me to a path where I feel like there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the classrooms and outside of the classrooms to help our students grow.
Thank you very much. I'm so thrilled that you're here, as well as Jennifer and Felisa. And your response there actually is a perfect segue into the first big question that I'd like to pose. So Dr. Jaber, if it's okay, let's stay with you for this, is how has your cultural identity, so just for our audience, let me, I'll provide a context around this question. So when you think in terms of our identity, there's a number of factors that play a role in that. So there's our race, our ethnicity, our socioeconomic status, our gender identity, our sexual orientation, language, religion, and ability. So in the context of all of those different categories, this is why identity is very complex. And if you'll notice, in many of those categories, it's fluid. So I'll give you all an example. Age, for example, you start off in the subordinate component of the cultural dynamic as far as your identity goes. Then you become part of the dominant. And if you're fortunate to live long enough, you'll end up back in the subordinate. Now, with that being said, so we'll start off with you, Dr. Jaber. Can you share a little bit around essentially how has your cultural identity shaped not only who you are, but your role as an educator? And in addition to that, why is that important for your role as an educator? Please.
So I think for me, it's a little bit more complex because I come from a family of Palestinian refugees. And my parents grew up in refugee camps. And so what that usually means is when you're forcefully displaced from somewhere, you have a tendency to kind of hold on to your culture and your religion and those things that you take with you from when you're leaving your homeland. And so for my parents, it was really important for them to really preserve the culture and preserve the religion in their kids. And I would say that kind of led to like a failed according to Banks, where they don't really ever feel like that culture and that religion is ever accepted in the great America that we have today. And so as a student, for sure, I was never seen, and I didn't have the knowledge or the words to name what that looked like for me as a child. I was often handed texts right down to college that were supposed to be culturally responsive and were supposed to represent me, but represented a whitewashed stereotypical version of who I was. I came from a family that was very proud of their cultural and religious identity, but looking back in hindsight today, I can visibly pick out the situations that as a student, there was an intentional negation and invisibility to my teachers of my identity. And the irony of how visible that was to peers in the classroom and how seen we were when it came to bullying in the classroom, and how that's only gotten worse with time. Like even comparing my two children, my oldest and my youngest, 13 and 22, their experiences of being bullied as Arabs with a growing anti-Arab and anti-Islamic sentiment have gotten more and more like worse with time. And so, and it's to the point where it's defined my youngest child's school experience, and that really shouldn't have happened to any child. And every time I've tried to address it with the schools as a parent, they address students instead of addressing cultures of schools and trying to fix systems by putting a Band-Aid on it and making the bullying worse for my child instead of actually fixing things. So I would say that we don't realize as educators how much these things impact students, like the experiences that they have in middle school and elementary school, follow them through college and through their adult college and career worlds, and that defines their identity. I would say too, like our identity as Arabs and as Muslims is the untold story. We're not recognized on the census, right? So we are invisible in terms of data, we're invisible in terms of support, we're invisible in terms of social and emotional learning. And so, but very visible when it comes to bullying and being singled out in schools. And so that's an irony and I think a unique situation for a lot of our kids. And so, implementing a social justice curriculum in a lot of schools and kind of working with kids and having like critical conversations and doing equity conferences focused on students has been a large part of my work.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And Before we shift to the next panelist, I do want to add for our audience here, what you touched on is a big question I encourage educators to ask, and that is, what are the hidden stories of your students that will not only inform you in your pedagogical practice, but also in your human purpose around education? And what mechanisms are you creating to, quite frankly, to learn those stories? You know, and I really appreciate you sharing that, because what you literally just touched on, to me, is a critical component of why we even have these conversations as well, is not looking strictly at the context of what is a culturally responsive pedagogy, because that even of itself has limitations that you just shared. It's also, what is the culture of our learning environments, of our schools, of our districts in general, that just the very nature of its design essentially silences varying groups. And obviously you shared yours, and I would actually even argue that the more that we learn about the hidden stories of our students, of our colleagues, and of our classmates, if we're a student, the more it can make for a much stronger and richer learning environment as well. So I appreciate you sharing that, and I think it's important for our audience to understand, like you shared, that, you know, for you and for many of my friends that whose families have immigrated, or whether it's by choice or by circumstance, if you will, to the United States, that there's still this, you know, just because you move a place doesn't mean that you essentially strip yourself or remove any component of your identity in that process. So thank you so much for sharing that. And what I'd like to do is shift, and we'll go in reverse order now. So Jen, if you could share with the audience, you know, elements of your identity and how it's shaped not only who you are, but how that ties in, as Dr. Jaber just shared, into your educational experiences, one growing up and even now, please.
Okay, so one of the reasons I became an educator was I was not a great student in school and didn't feel seen. So I totally relate to that. And especially middle school, struggling with my sexual orientation and not understanding who I was. And that was not something that anyone talked about, especially, I'm aging myself, but back in the 80s and 90s, you certainly were not talking about sexual identity and gender identity and all of those things. And so for me, I struggled as a student to understand who I was. And so therefore I was not invested in my educational experience. And so when I decided I wanted to be an educator, I wanted to be someone that students felt like they could come to and talk to about things like that. And that I could be, even though it was kind of quiet initially when I started teaching, I was told, don't come out, don't let anyone know you're gay. And when we fit into boxes, and I don't fit into that box of presenting non-gay, I guess would someone say, and in terms of I own my comfort level in the way I present myself, and so people go, oh, you must be gay. So I never hid that, but I didn't talk about it. It was still one of those, well, let's not mention it to the students. Don't talk about it. We kind of know that that's the case, and in my first school district, I endured a number of gay slurs and inappropriate comments that were made to me, and that it was like, made me feel like, okay, less than myself. And then because I hid it, that to me is not giving a positive image for students, because if I'm not being authentically me, students see that and they're like, well, if Ms. Hall has to hide that, do I need to hide that? And that was a real struggle for me. And eventually I left that school district and came to Atlanta. And I've got to praise Atlanta for the fact that at the time, that was in 2002, they were the only school district in the state of Georgia that had sexual orientation in their non-discrimination policy. And that's why I chose to come to Atlanta. And so I was able to be a little more authentically me, especially in the workplace with colleagues, but still felt fearful of being honest in my classroom, because I did not want there to be any misconstrued, why are you telling students that? Why is that important? And I honestly was very, very still closeted. And that was a struggle for me, because I saw students struggling like I did. And I'm like, well, I'm not helping them if I can't be me and they can't see that it's going to be okay. And so my second to last year in the classroom, I actually had a student that admittedly was struggling. And I was able to be honest with, it's okay to have a partner. It's okay to be attracted to someone else and be who you are. And it was very freeing for me. And it was being authentic was a big deal for students to see that. So I think so, my space and my identity would definitely be coming from, being a queer educator and owning that and being authentically me and being able to say my wife in a safe space, and students see that that's okay, and colleagues go, oh, okay. I think that that's really, really important. And again, I got to commend our district, because they have become more vocal and supportive of LGBTQ students, including participating in the Pride March each year. And even this last year, I marched with our district with the superintendent, literally dancing through the streets in the rain, and kids literally seeing that and seeing, okay, it's okay to be you. That's really, really important. And they've started a task force for LGBTQ issues in our district. So I've seen it in the 24 years, a lot has changed. It's gotten better. It's not where it needs to totally be, but there's definitely been movement. But I think it takes educators feeling like they can be themselves and be authentically themselves. And that's where I've had to get to be me and be models for students to see that, it's tough right now, but it does get better.
You bring up an important point. Both you and Dr. Jaber bring up an important point, and then Felisa will shift over to you in just a second. You two have shared something that I think is important for the audience and the viewers to know about the two of you. What you two have shared around your personal experiences, and more specifically your own identities, my contention and my argument is that has made me a more informed friend. And I would say, when you start getting in terms of, are you an ally, or are you an accomplice, all those sorts of things, ultimately, the more that we gain a better understanding of each other, the more that we can be more appropriately responsive to each other's needs. And then the more informed we are, the more that we can develop what I would call sustainable degrees of compassion. And you two both brought up in your personal stories why it's critical for anyone watching, why it's critical for you to interrogate any social and emotional learning program that doesn't involve anti-bias and anti-racist training ongoing. And you have written, as Jen just shared, in policy, inclusive mechanisms and appropriately inclusive language, putting on paper that you are going to reject anything that creates a barrier to anyone who's along the lines of any of those cultural identities that I shared, including obviously two that were just shared now. I think it's important because ultimately, if we can't be our whole selves, then we don't get the best of each other, and our students don't get the best of our learning experiences. So Jen, thank you so much for sharing that. And then finally, Felisa, let's round this question up with you. How has, your identity and your own personal experiences shaped you as an educator now, and even through your own educational experience?
So for me, growing up in a small town in the South in Mississippi, that race has always been front and center of my life. And even in high school, I remember this incident that just stood out, often being one of a few Black students or African American students in a class, or even in a higher level class, and having a guidance counselor tell me my senior year, when I told him my interest in going to an HBCU, the comment, instead of being supportive, the comment from the guidance counselor is, why would you want to go to a school like that? You should be going to and he mentioned a PWI. And so thank goodness my parents had instilled in us, and coming from your home culture, it influences you and influences you to have that independence and that voice. So I had a voice, and I was able to advocate for myself. And so I explained to him the purpose of me wanting to do that, but just thinking about all of those students who can't advocate for themselves. So that's why it's so important for educators to always not only be aware of your own cultural identity, your own home cultural, identity and awareness, but also be aware of the students that you impact, because whether they're unconscious bias or whatever, things that we say, do, or ignore impact students. So we have to always remember that. And I think that is most important. And it's always important for us to pour into our students that however they identify, whether it's a racial line or gender line or anything, it is important for us to support that, and important for them to be able to have a voice in our classrooms, important for them to be able to see themselves in the content that we teach, and also the experiences that we offer for our students.
Yeah, thank you. And, so I'm actually going to change the next question I was going to pose to the three of you. And Jen, I'll share this one. I'll let you respond to this one first.
Okay.
Because you all have brought up something that I think is, and I'm being intentional with the language I'm getting ready to use. All three of you have shared components of your schooling experience and your lived experience that I identify as a type of identity deprivation. You were deprived in some way of being your whole, true, authentic self. And I can't help but ask the following question, because I really want our audience to get more into the mind of your thinking and your thoughts around how would you estimate that those instances that you all experience, and again, Jen, we'll go with you first, how would you estimate that affects education in general? Because obviously the three of you, sadly, do not represent an outlier. You represent the norm to a large extent within each of your unique components. How would you identify, or how would you, I guess for lack of a better term, how would you describe how your identity deprivation affects and could affect education in general?
That's a great question. So I think that in terms of as my being a queer educator, and if you think about, historically, there's been a lot of laws that have even prohibited teachers about speaking out about their sexual orientation, and they can get fired. And so there are a lot of teachers that I know that won't be out about it because they're fearful of reprisal or losing their jobs. I know for a fact people that have lost their jobs as a result of that. I think that it was real. I will have to tell you that students used to ask me, because they want to be in my business. Middle school students, they always want to ask questions. Let's
Yes,
be honest.
they do.
So I'll give a specific example. For the longest time, my wife has packed my lunch. It's kind of silly, but she packed my lunch, and my sixth grade students would ask me, Miss Hall, what do you have for lunch today? And I would say, well, I don't know. And they'd say, well, what do you mean you don't know? And I'm like, I don't pack my lunch. And they're like, you have a lunch packer? Who is this lunch packer? They wanted to know about me, and I did not feel open to say, by the way, yeah, it's my partner at the time, we weren't married. I looped with those students from 6th to 7th to 8th grade. In 8th grade, they were still asking about the lunch packer and whether the lunch packer was also my spouse that I would never talk about. But I did not feel open to share that with them because, again, even though in the space, it's not against Atlanta or anything like that, but you just never know if you can be authentically yourself and what you might encounter as a result of being who you are. But at that last couple of years where I was kind of like open about who I was, and it wasn't like I'm talking and telling my business at school, but if a teacher who is married, who is cisgender, is heterosexual, and they put their wedding picture in their classroom to show who they're married to, and it's okay, then I should be able to be as honest about who my partner is and show that that's my life. But I have to say it was a big weight lifted off of me. I felt freer and less encumbered in terms of, I don't know, it felt like this big weight lifted. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Because there wasn't this, be careful what you say because it could be misconstrued, or be careful that someone might say something. And that was a big problem. And I felt bad that I shortchanged kids that would.
I think we may have lost.
Oh, she might have froze.
She might have frozen.
We broke the internet.
Right.
Well, hopefully she'll make it back, or it will unfreeze. But for those of you watching and listening, you just heard Jen share that, when it cut off, unfortunately, her thinking in terms of what her students would have lost out on or did lose out on for that. And so, Felisa, let's go to you now to kind of share your thoughts around, the question of how has your experience and your what I would call, again, identity deprivation, how has that played a role in education in general, in the context of what we're talking about?
Right. Unfortunately, it is sad to say that with me being in high school in the 80s and then fast forward to now 2020 and dealing with what students have to deal with, we see the same thing still happening as when it comes to race and children of color. We see that, in separate but equal, separate but unequal, unconstitutional, separate and equal, we still see that. We still see separate schools, unequal situations, even in 2020. And although we want to say that we have progressed since the Supreme Court ruling, you can go across any school district in the United States, even today, and you will see these concentrated, segregated schools. You will also see within schools across the United States, students, when you have, whether it's a white student or an Asian student, and you have a student of color with the same qualifications, you are less likely to see the student of color in an advanced class. So there have been issues with that. Your students aren't pushed, and even when students are concentrated in these segregated classes or segregated schools, oftentimes the resources aren't even the same, and they could be in the same school district. So this is just a problem that we have, and our biases that we bring, or our knowledge that we bring of who we are and who other colleagues and students are, we put that on our children. We see it in discipline data. As a high school administrator, we see how children of color are there's a disparity in how they are disciplined, there's a disparity in how they are suspended, and that just happens across the United States. And that happens also because people are putting their biases on students, so that's something that we really have to check ourselves as educators. We have to do that reflection of your interaction with students, and are you bringing biases and projecting those onto these students? And that's why we see this disparity. And I get so passionate about, how students are treated in the world of education, because we're supposed to be here to help students, but oftentimes we harm them by our policies and our practices and how we interact with them on a daily basis.
That's right, and that's been shared. Jen, welcome back.
Sorry, I froze there for a second. I was like, hopefully, did you get most of what I said before I froze?
We got some of it. Before we shift over to Dr. Jaber, I'd love to let you go ahead and finish your thoughts. You were talking about, you were literally in the middle of that in the context of you not revealing who packs your lunch and the students you had over a multi-year period, that how they may have missed out on getting to know your full authentic self.
Yeah, and I apologize there. Apparently, internet struggle bus, I was in timeout. So the struggle is real, folks. So I was just saying that was one of the things that I wasn't able to be authentic and share with my students, that so many other teachers, heterosexual teachers are like, oh, let me put up my family photo. And I would always be fearful of doing that. So my students were always like, oh, your family's a mystery. What do we know about them? And it was always just a little frustrating. But I think if I had been authentic at the time and not been as worried about what the repercussions were, that would have been beneficial to more of my students to see, hey, it's okay that I might be questioning my own, sexual orientation or gender identity and all of that. I think that's, very important to model that for students, to be publicly visible for students to go, I don't know. I think that was something I regret that I wish I had done sooner in my education, as my time as an educator in the classroom. But now that I still work with students, I'm definitely very more authentically myself, and that weight has been lifted. And I think that when you were talking about that, the limits that I was feeling, that was definitely, stepping out of my own comfort zone. But I'll have to say, some of it's self-imposed, and in the queer community, they would probably agree that a lot of that self-imposed, that we're like, it's hard for us to be our authentic selves. And you and I've had a talk about that, before. So it's tough. It's challenging, but I think it's very important. And I have to give a shout out to a group that was formed at ISTE. As
Edgy Pride Alliance.
Yes, the Edgy Pride Alliance.
That's right.
And I got to give them a shout out that they formed there. I joined after the fact, but it is educators that are both queer educators and allies that want to bring that to the forefront to talk about ways we can support educators as well as students that are questioning. And it's you definitely need to check out their resources. They've got some great stuff. But yeah, I mean, and it's nice to have that community now that I've found. So there we go. Thank you for letting me finish my thought. And I'm hoping, fingers crossed, internet's going to hang in a little bit longer. We can do it.
It's okay. We're doing the best. So thank you. And thank you for sharing that. And then, so let's finish up with Dr. Jaber. You know, you've heard Felisa and Jen's story. And so with you, Dr. Jaber, I'd love for you to share just again, you know, how would you look at the obstacles and the environments that you had to navigate in which you couldn't be your full, true, authentic self? How do you think that has played a role really in education in general, but then obviously you'll be able to cite some more specifics around your own experiences?
So I think Felisa referred to being separate and unequal still. And I think that the biggest problem is that we've been socialized to think it's a norm and to accept it as the norm. And so some of the implications of that is that we still continue to have like a demographic divide between educators and teachers that keeps teachers from being able to understand students in order to be able to meet their needs and develop their skills to be active participants in changing the status quo. Kids continue to not be seen beyond a single story stereotype, and that invisibility is defeating them and causing no disruption to oppressive systems because we've been socialized to see them as norms. Teachers, even who are talking about race and justice, as they think it's political. So they have a fear of empowering students with criticality. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this saying, like, let's not bring politics into the classroom. Well, this isn't politics if we're talking about the livelihood of people, right? And we are in the business of building people. And so how can you separate those two things from each other? And if it's not happening in our classrooms, then where is it happening? I mean, even as a teacher who is a teacher of color, often the diverse teachers are silenced or viewed as problematic and angry. And so like I've been called a terrorist by peers. I've been one of the teachers walked into my classroom one day and said, how do you feel after what your people did in France, referencing an ISIS bombing? And she was teaching in a school with a 611% growth of Middle Eastern students in the same district. And so my first thought went to, how is this playing out in the classroom with students who look like me every single day? And what kind of, we call them microaggressions, but they're definitely not microaggressions because they're things that really took a toll on me as an adult and a professional in the classroom. I can't imagine what it's doing to adolescents who are still trying to figure out who they are in the world. And I think that COVID gave us a chance to really, it highlighted the oppressive systems that exist and the inequities in our schools and in our systems, and gave schools and districts a chance to really reimagine schools and reform them and reshape them. But instead, I think the focus of a lot of conversation by educators in schools was, how can we preserve these old systems that weren't working for kids to begin with? And so we're definitely failing, and all of it is kind of tied into each other, because we're only seeing single stories, because it's only one voice that's being represented, and it's the voice of power that's historically been there, and every other voice is not there. Oftentimes, even those doing the equity work aren't recognizing the problems, and we're calling out for cultural responsiveness. I think cultural responsiveness isn't enough. And even when we're talking about cultural responsiveness, that's giving a child a mirror. But how do we actually get the children to become a part of changing the systems and putting a cog in this wheel that continues to keep going and going? And that's where we need to be aiming. So even when we're talking about cultural responsiveness, I feel like that's a problem in and of itself. In the equity work, we need to be aiming for a critical race theory. We need to be looking at the highest level. We need to be talking about scholar activism with our students. We need to be showing those qualities and skills by being their co-collaborators and their allies in the classroom and out of the classroom, and modeling those things every single day in everything that we do, beyond just putting things that look great on paper and checking off the box that we're doing what we need to be doing to be culturally responsive.
That is so true.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I
was going to say,
I think you go ahead, Felisa. Go, please.
I was going to say, I think that is definitely one thing where we fall short in education. We don't even feel comfortable enough to just have dialogue in the classroom and just let students have that conversation, that dialogue, so that they can begin to understand each other or to see different perspectives. We do a lot of hiding behind the curriculum or the content so that we don't have to deal with those difficult, necessary conversations. And I think if we can start opening up the classrooms to have those types of conversations, then we can begin to understand each other better and break down some of these misconceptions and perceptions that we have of each other.
Well, I'd like to add, I completely agree with what you're saying here, Felicia, that, you know, the conversations, the curriculum, though, that's where we need to start with, because for so many teachers, that's the baseline. That's where they're going to start. And if the curriculum doesn't even have it in there, they're like, well, if it's not in the curriculum, I don't need to talk about it.
Right.
And I kind of think that that's kind of one of the problems that we face in terms of inclusion and providing that insight and exposure to different content, I think is very, very important. But that was very powerful. I agree with, we need to, you have that high school mindset, Dr. Jaber, because of the fact that you're like, we need to get these students to be activists and things like that. And I think you're right. If we're hoping that there's going to be changes, we've got to work with those students now. And sorry, I just wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I'd like to just piggyback on that really quickly. And definitely, like, I think high school is where a lot of those skills are going to be polished, but I really think that seed needs to be planted much earlier than high school, so that at high school level, you're cultivating it. And with regards to like the curriculum, I've seen schools that have tried to input things in the curriculum, and then you have a bunch of teachers who really don't understand and have their biases that are blinding them. And so it really needs to start with like policy and immersion. It needs to start with like immersing teachers in communities and getting them to really understand those communities, and then shifting that, because what happens is when we start changing curriculum, I've often seen good intent harm students, because the curriculum that's meant to be a mirror to other kids, and that was my experience, was actually very stereotypical. And so these kids are, instead of seeing themselves in an accurate lens, are seeing themselves in a more stereotypical lens, and then they start to question who they are. And all of a sudden you have a kid who's Muhammad, who all of a sudden he wants to be Mo because he feels like he can't identify with even his name, which is a core part of his identity, and then starts to shed off that cultural and linguistic and the culturally diverse and that linguistic pluralism at the school door because it's unacceptable in school. So I feel like curriculum is something that definitely needs to be modified, but there's so much work that needs to happen in the background first in order for teachers to be able to teach that curriculum with fidelity in the classroom.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, but also we have to get teachers to be okay with uncomfortable conversations, and that's where we need to start. But what was interesting, I was an ELA teacher, but I would tie in social studies and other content. And so I taught at the time, I taught in a school that was 98% African American and 2% other minorities. And when we would get to talking about civil rights issues and Black history, I actually had a student say directly to me that it made them uncomfortable having me teach them about the civil rights movement. And because they look at me as the face of this white person talking to them about the struggle. And at that time I was like, okay, you're right. I've never experienced that kind of prejudice. Because she said to me, well, you've never experienced any prejudice. No one's ever treated you differently because of who you are. And at that same time, I wanted to say, well, actually, I have experienced it's not racially based, but it's based on something else. So that's also something teachers have got to get comfortable with. Maybe, and it was a challenge because, yes, as a white educator talking about civil rights issues and having students go, well, why are you telling me about this? This is not your history. And that's where they need to understand that when we talk about history, it's all of our history. So that was, a challenge for me. And I think it's probably a challenge for a lot of other teachers in terms of feeling that discomfort talking about things.
So those of you listening and watching, now you see why I was so thrilled having this panel. I'm sitting here listening, getting goosebumps, and I want to, we're going to shift into the next question before we get to the last question and final statements. What I want to point out are a couple of things that Dr. Jaber just, actually all three of you actually just examined. So first of all, the use of the word microaggression. What I think it's important for everyone to understand is that microaggression is not small in impact. It might be small in the incident, a comment here or a certain look there, but ultimately it's the impact. So they might be micro in the act itself, but they are macro in the effect. And too often the excuse is used, the excuse to hide responsibility, personalized responsibility around that is the word intent. And I will share with you all, intent means nothing. The focus has to be on what is the impact of your words and your actions, because both matter. And then also, you know, what you all are sharing here that I think is important for the audience to know is that education is political by design, period. If you think about the very nature of education is to create a generation of participants in society. And to Dr. Jaber's point, I actually, honestly, Dr. Jaber, I think it's a both and I'll share a brief comment. I want to go to the question because this panel is about you all, not me. I think that we have to interpret the curriculum to the point where we embody a mindset of decolonizing the curriculum. Because as I look at and listen to the three of you, I think in terms of like how many representations was I provided as a student and did I have access to as a teacher to where all of my students, you know, as you mentioned, it's one of my favorite metaphorical representations of learning is you mentioned the mirrors. How many windows did I get? How many sliding glass doors did I get? Luckily for me, in the context of how I was raised and the school that I went to, I had a wide degree of diversity of access based on proximity to a whole bunch of different experiences that my classmates had that exposed me to a lot of windows and a lot of sliding glass doors. But that was based on proximity. What I want us to do is to be able to do that from an educational intent, which to your point means you have to start interrogating that curriculum. And, you know, for educators listening to this that say, well, you can't change your curriculum, you can't do this, you can't do that. Listen, there's a couple of things that you want to be able to look at. Number one, there are ways to navigate within the curriculum, and I use that in air quotes, to ensure diversity of access and opportunity. And then there's also the whole idea around what are my actions perpetuating? Are my actions aligned with diversity of access to myself and my students? Or am I just simply perpetuating a status quo by going with the quote unquote curriculum? I think we need to reject the whole idea around, well, it's in a curriculum, because that's just dismissive. That's not calling people in. And so what I want to do real quick with the three of you is for everyone listening, if you've noticed, those are three distinctly different stories aligned with the experiences that are the purpose of us having these conversations. What I'd like to do is, Felisa, let's start off with you, so that because that way all of you have had a chance to respond first. I would like for you all to share with the audience your thoughts on the intersectionality of all of your unique experiences and how we together can look at the word intersectionality, which means, and Jen just shared that as well. You know, there's the idea that your students felt, well, how can you teach me about civil rights when you haven't necessarily experienced any degrees of oppression? And you and I both know in our conversations and what you shared, that's absolutely not true. We need to reject that. What I'd like for you all to share with the audience is ways in which the word intersectionality, so our unique individual experiences, but the intersections between those experiences might help those listening be more informed as educators on what they could do for their first steps in regards to decolonizing the curriculum and providing more access and opportunity for students to learn more than just that is aligned with their own cultural identity. So Felisa, if you don't mind first.
So one thing that I think is very important for educators to know that there are so many different layers to all of us, and that on any given day that their students, they are being impacted by the intersectionality of identifying markers or those things that they can relate with. And I'll just give you an example just in education as an African-American female in leadership in education. And then this lets you know if I'm dealing with this, imagine what students are dealing with. So I'm dealing with the race and the gender piece, you know, the idea of a female leader. So I was an interim principal at a high school, had been in administration forever, had all of this experience of leading, being a school leader. The position came open for the job. The person that they named as the principal was a white male who had never had leadership experience, didn't know anything about it, but there were the other APs on the leadership team had years of leadership experience. So he was placed, had so many issues running the school. We were having to literally train him. So because at that point I had been running the school, but I'm having to train him how to do his job, to be the leader, to be this principal. And can I tell you, it took everything in me. And then because he was threatened not only by the color of my skin, but by my gender, he proceeded to, you know, how people, that microaggression, as you said, and I was experiencing that on a daily basis. And you're right, it impacts, it's very impactful. Those can be defining moments in who you are and how you see the world. So he took, and I knew my worth. So he took my skills, my knowledge, which was, he was threatened by. He proceeded to make me in charge of buses, going from running the school to now I'm in charge of buses. And so that was the very day I left that bus notebook on that desk and I went downtown and resigned, because knowing my value and knowing my worth and knowing what I bring to the table is so important for people to know that, and for educators to know how their interactions with others can impact them years down the road, you know, and impact how they see themselves. So I think we have to be so cautious of how that intersectionality and how we deal with people. And I know I'm rambling about that, but it was just a lived and learned experience for me, and just experiencing that in my professional career, that was just something that has really impacted me going forward and how I deal with others and how I deal with the work that I do now.
No, thank you for sharing that. And I think it's important, you know, you brought up another point, and then Dr. Jaber will shift over to you. One of the questions I always ask is, when I go into schools, if I find an educator of color, especially, why do I'll give you all an example, and then I want to shift over to Dr. Jaber. How come I go to schools and if I see a black male educator, they're never the literacy or the math coach? They're always the dean. They're always an athletic coach. I've never seen it. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I've never seen it. And you know, if you think in terms of the complexity of all of our experiences here, again, for me, I've been able to connect with all three of you because I've identified commonality in either our purpose, our mission, and then because of getting to know all three of you to the degree that I have, which I wish we could have had this conversation in person, it helps me look at some of our shared struggles, some of our shared accomplishments, some of our shared achievements, and then how are those aligned with our shared purpose and our shared mission. So I think it's important for those of you watching and those of you listening to really look at what is the common ground that we can build a solid foundation to grow from together. And so now I want to shift over to you, Dr. Jaber, is the whole idea around intersectionality. And obviously you've shared the complexity of your identity, and how does that play a critical role in our collective work together?
So I think it's important to recognize, especially for kids who are first generation and second generation Americans and who come from families that have immigrated here and are really like proud and hold strongly to their home cultures and identities, that those kids often feel like they belong, they're not here or there. Like when their race is, especially when their race is tied to a different country and a different ethnicity and is severely misunderstood here, it's intentionally misrepresented, it's defaced by a culture of fear, and at the same time, you're trying to, you're expected by your family and your parents to really hold on to those things, and you love your culture and your religion and you want to hold on to it. You feel like you're not fully accepted as an American, but you're not fully accepted in your ethnic country either. So you have a sense of displacement, and that is, I think, all the research shows that having a feeling of inclusivity in schools shows much higher gains and growth in adolescence than even like the best teaching and learning. And so that feeling of inclusivity or exclusivity, what does that do to kids? We're constantly talking about student growth, and we're talking about standards and meeting standards, and how can we get kids to like grow, and looking at subgroups because of ESSA and other things. And you're not really focusing on the core issue here, which is these kids don't feel like they belong, and so they'll never bring their whole self to the classroom door. And as long as that's happening, and on top of that, the added layer of them not understanding why and not being able to name those things. As a bachelor's college student, I still wasn't able to name those things. It wasn't until I think in my master's degree where I started to like understand more and more, and it was my PhD that really opened my eyes to like how deep these problems were and how far they spanned, and I really understood my positionality. So I think one of the biggest and most important things is that we really need to talk to kids about their positionality. They need to understand their positionality, and it shouldn't be in high stakes where they're thrown into this new world and they're out of these bubbles that we create in middle school and high school, and now they're in the real world in college, and their life is the foundations of their life are being placed, and they don't have the knowledge or ability to either self-advocate or to understand why or to change their status quo in any shape or form. So I think conversations around positionality, getting kids to understand how we got here and how we can get out of here, right? Those are two very important things. Those need to be happening across the board, across classrooms. It shouldn't be like if you're in Miss J's class, you're lucky because you're having these conversations, or not lucky because you perceive Miss J as pushing an agenda. That's happened too, right? Because if I'm talking about these things and I'm the only teacher talking about it, then a lot of times the kids are like, why does everything have to be about race? They don't understand either. And so it needs to be systemic, it needs to be intentional, it needs to be all hands on deck, it needs to be all stakeholders included in order for us to really disrupt these systems and reshape these systems. So that it needs to be policy, it needs to be HR, it needs to be curriculum, it needs to be all those things together. And only then can we really start to understand the layers of people's identity. Like as a Muslim, I'm a Muslim Arab female, so my scarf, automatically people associate me with ISIS and other terrorist groups. My brown skin color becomes a problem because I'm associated as a Palestinian Arab. That even takes it to a further degree, because I remember in third grade being asked to place a thumb, to point out Palestine, and Palestine didn't exist on the map anymore because there's an intentional erasure there. So even my identity as my ethnicity is completely erased. So where do I identify there? And I'm a female. And so trying to get into, like what Felisa said, getting into leadership roles for me has been almost a dead end. Like I've tried and tried and tried, and every time I do, one of my friends even joked, change your name to Susan on your resume and maybe they'll interview you. Yeah. And it was a joke to her, and to me that was like, if I'm going to have to start letting go of who I am, I don't want to work for your system anyway, right? And I'll find another outlet for me to be able to do this work and impact these systems. So that's what my intersections have done for me. Like every one of the layers of my intersection presents as a problem in our current society that I'm trying to navigate.
And so thinking about that, imagine for raising a Black male and trying to give them an opportunity, in this world that we're living in, even down to being so deliberate about naming your child, because there's so many layers to the levels of those isms that they will face. And it's just so difficult to navigate all of that. And it's so unfortunate that you have to go to that magnitude to just try to give a child a chance in this world that we live in right now.
Yeah, and and by the way, again, thank you, Dr. Jaber, for sharing all of that, because I think for our viewers and our listeners, it's really what you're seeing is exactly why I'm asking these questions, that we are complex, and the more intentional we are on being inclusive, being compassionate, and the phrase I like to use is embodying a mindset of cognitive humility. You don't know everything, you're not gonna know everything, and if you recognize that there's a whole lot of learning to do, and to Dr. Jaber's point, there's a whole lot of unlearning to do. I think in terms of my schooling, especially my master's degree program, there was nothing in the quote unquote standards for the program that involved critical race theory or that involved cultural identity, nothing. And so I want to give a few minutes for Jen to share her thoughts on this question, but I do want to also emphasize that, it's where we want to really think in terms of what comes first, policy or people. I think that policy drives people and people reinforce policy, but it's not, and it's a both and situation. And so to what you all just heard from both Felisa and Dr. Jaber is the whole idea around, we have to be able to do our internal work, but then we also have to have policy that reinforces the doing of the internal work, that reinforces the culture of our schools and our school systems, and that also is intentionally designed with the language for it to be inclusive. And I don't mean inclusion like the annual multicultural festival, which I reject those as well, because those, I don't have time to get into it, but I can go into the whole story of how those are actually more harmful than they are good. And in fact, I would argue that multicultural festivals are usually to pacify white liberals. But again, that's a whole nother conversation to have. For now, what I want to go is to Jen, and then we'll take some final comments. I know I wanted to try to touch on one question that was in the chat. Just if Jen, if you don't mind, in about 2 minutes or less, share your thoughts around intersectionality and how it plays a role in education, because you've already identified how you're female, what your sexual orientation is, the whole deal. I mean, there's intersectionality there. You're white. So if you don't mind, just share some thoughts around that and how we can identify, how it can serve us better by understanding that better, please.
And I think that that's one of the things is that we need to figure out how, I guess, not put people in boxes. And that's what we're so used to doing. Like, I'm going to check this box. You're white and you're female, and okay, you're black, you're Muslim, all of those, like, okay, you're gay, I'm going to put you in that box. And I don't think anyone fits in that box. And also when we think about our students, there's things that on the exterior we fit in a box. So, like Dr. Jaber said, people see your scarf, so automatically they have that assumption about you because of your physical outer appearance. Because I present more masculine than feminine, therefore people go, aha, let's check that box. And so I think it's really important that there's our students, part of our identities are internalized. There's things on our inside that we're struggling. So when I'm speaking, about queer students and queer educators, what we experience about gender identity, what we experience about our sexual orientation, and even, transgendered individuals that are just trying to figure out who they are, we can't say it's one size fits all and we're going to put you in a box. And it frustrates me when we have programs or things in place at schools that are automatically like you're male or female, so you fit in one of those two boxes. This is what boys do, let's put you in that box. This is what girls do, let's put you in that box. So I think that we have to unlearn that as educators, that we can't, there's not an either or category for all students. And that goes even to starting with students that are younger, up into high school. I had the opportunity to, work at one of my schools where we were doing the 8th grade superlatives, and the students were supposed to vote on top boy and top girl in the categories. But then there was a student, a classmate of theirs, that was transgender. And their question was, where do they fit in that box? And that really shouldn't be. We shouldn't classify and say that everything is either about boy or girl, black or white, brown. So I think that when we talk about the intersectionality, it needs to be about people. Like you said, people first. If we think about that and not necessarily put people in that box. Does that make sense? I mean,
it makes total sense. And in fact, you and I want to go to final comments. We'll go back to Dr. Jaber for final comments, but I want to bolster what you're saying. It makes total sense. And this is where, for school leaders, you always hear data-driven decision-making. Let's shift over to people-driven decision-making and start rejecting the boxes. We always want to compartmentalize so that we can, think about it from this standpoint. The easier you compartmentalize, the more easily it is to stratify. And so the more we reject that, the more we can start to dismantle the stratification on at least on a pathway towards more equality and equity in that capacity. So Jen, we'll come back to you for the final amongst you three, and then I'll close out this session. Dr. Jaber, I'll shift back over to you. Can you just share, and I would say in about 30 to 45 seconds or less, just some final comments and potentially a call to action for our audience, please?
So I think the biggest thing is we really need to see beyond the labels that were placed on people to keep them in a hierarchy that was meant to oppress them. And that really takes a lot of work, whether it's immersing yourself in communities, embracing the discomfort that comes with putting yourself in a vulnerable position and having those conversations, putting yourself, they sometimes say on the chopping block, like possibly putting yourself in a place where you can be this voice for your students and advocate for them. If there's nobody else advocating for them, look for your allies in your buildings. There are allies in your buildings, probably scared to speak up as well. Find those allies, understand your community, and speak up for them. And definitely technology is a great opportunity. Like today we were able to talk about the most recent shootings in my classroom because students have Twitter, they have Facebook, they have Instagram, and they're very much aware. And so I completely discarded and threw away my lesson for today's class, and we talked about what was going on in current events and tied it to everything else that we were talking about. So the technology gives us the opportunity to have those mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors immediately. We don't don't have to wait for those things to happen anymore. We don't have to wait for news to travel because it's at their fingertips. And we have the ability to create those situations where the kids can have those conversations in a very critical way with you as a model in the classroom all the time. And so I hope that people can start to figure out where you are in the process and work your way from there, but start somewhere. And I think that's the most important thing, that we all have to start somewhere. Enough is enough.
Thank you so much. And we're going to shift over to Felisa in just a moment, but I do want to highlight something that you just did. That's something I used to do that I encourage educators to do, and I think it's important. Don't lose out on a critical teaching moment to engage in necessary dialogue on what's going on right now. What you just shared, you said, I got a lesson plan, I'm going to forego that. What I will encourage everyone who's watching and listening, that is one of the easiest mechanisms to ensure that you're meeting the social and emotional needs of your students. A lot of students are going to react differently to what is happening as far as real-time events. The more that they recognize that addressing and even having dialogue around those events in a supportive and understanding capacity, an authentic capacity, is going to help advance learning, as Dr. Jaber even shared. I mean, you mentioned even the data. It doesn't matter what the pedagogy is. If you're engaging in inclusivity of culture, inclusivity of dialogue, and understanding of differences, that's going to advance learning far more than any pedagogical practice. So I'm so glad that you shared that. So thank you very much. Felisa, let's shift over to you now, please.
So I totally agree. What I would just share with educators is that it's important to do those self-checks of our own biases, because our life experiences, whether we know it or not, it impacts how we think, but it's so important for us to check those so that we can then begin to become more aware of our students and what they're bringing to our classroom, so that we can have those deep, rich experiences for those students. It is on us to provide students with those opportunities for those discussions. Just be bold in allowing your students to have these discussions, to learn about each other, to talk about and question things that are happening. That's how we make change, slowly but surely. So just give students those opportunities. Be the first in your school to do it. Be bold. Just know you're doing the right thing.
That's right. Thank you. And as I say it, and I'm going to even quote Nipsey Hussle, I say it's a marathon, not a sprint, and quote Nipsey Hussle, the marathon continues. Jet, share some thoughts, final thoughts, and then I'll wrap this thing up, please.
Okay, I want to echo what Felisa said about being bold, and I think that that's something that teachers, as educators, most educators got into it because they wanted to have that impact on a student. They wanted to make those connections. So right now is the time that you've got to be bold and you've got to stretch yourself and be open to those conversations and acknowledge that there are differences in the world, there's differences in people, but that those differences are what make the world a better place, like making those connections. I'm thrilled to see that there's an effort being made for SEL in our district. And I think that that needs to be something, but in those SEL conversations, it shouldn't be like, here's a little mini lesson. I love what Dr. Jaber did today, where you went sideways on your lesson because of the real world connection that you can make with your students. And that's really what it's all about. If we put the students first, it's not about test scores. It's about the students, and maybe that lesson, that discussion that was had in that classroom today with Dr. Jaber's students, down the road, that student's going to remember that. That's the meaningful connections that students need, and the model that they need from educators.
And I was going to say one last thing. As educators too, it's important for you to feel comfortable enough with your colleagues to have some of those difficult conversations so that you can become more informed. Jen and I, we have conversations all the time just so that I am more informed on what I need to know to be able to do better and be better. So it's important for educators on all levels to be able to have those conversations so that we can be better and be there for our students as well.
Thank you. And I will say that to echo what all three of you shared, that, as I mentioned earlier, that's precisely why I am better informed and better understanding and certainly more responsive to all three of you in your unique areas of activism, of that validity, of identity, appreciation, and recognition, among many other things. What I'll share with the audience, for those of you viewing and listening, and just as some final thoughts, is one is a quote. It's one of my favorite quotes from Malala, and it is, "We realize the importance of our voices only when we are silenced." And so I would challenge everyone listening and watching, as you saw, or as you've heard in this, that there are a lot of hidden stories, and there are a lot of voices that either by design or by complacency are silenced. And we don't want our students to have to realize the importance of their voice because they're being silenced. We want them to realize the importance of our voice because we are encouraging them through degrees of self-advocacy and empowerment. And as Dr. Jaber shared, part of the idea around the mirrors, windows, sliding glass doors is with the use of technology and the responsible use of technology, we have a mechanism to provide our students with all three of those, the mirrors, windows, sliding glass doors. So I would encourage all of you to really help students identify who they are and how they can use their voice for change, how our students can be institutions of change within our educational systems, and recognize that even if you are you feel like you're in isolation using your voice in your respective classroom or of your respective school, that's where the technology will come in, because you're not, as you saw with this panel, three amazing panelists that I'm sorry that the time is up, but all of us are in this together, and the only way we can institute sustainable change is by coalescing around a common purpose. And that's where the intersectionality comes in. So that's why I can say that I am aligned with Felisa, Dr. Jaber, and Jen in everything that they do. I've been vocal, and I will continue to be vocal with it. And they all know that not only do I have your back, but I'm also going to be your shield when it's necessary. So I thank you all for joining us. I hope this has been a fruitful engagement of your time and a learning experience for you, and that you have some tangible next steps to be able to do. And ideally, we'll see you online, or we'll see you at some point at a conference. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.